Thanks, everyone. Sorry, sorry I can't be there with you today, but I've actually got a bad cold anyway, so probably better that I join in via Zoom. Excuse me in advance if I cough. I'll try and mute myself. So thanks for the opportunity to present on the RATE-AF trial. Obviously on behalf of all of the investigators, and I'll mention them at the end. My disclosures are here. The trial itself was funded publicly by the UK National Institute for Health Research. So I think I don't need to tell the audience here about the issues that we are likely to see with prevalence in AF. We've all seen these curves from different countries. This is one that we did in the UK, looking at primary care patients. But whatever area you look at, obviously there's a huge increase in prevalence in AF that's predicted. I think the detail here is important. I just want to go into that a little bit. Firstly, actually, sorry, this is not working. Firstly, the prevalence rise is really being fueled by incidence increases, but actually those aren't homogeneous. And what we see over time is that the increase in AF is predominantly happening in older people, not in younger people. And in fact, if we then look at the mortality, as you've seen with what John just presented, we're doing quite well actually in the younger type patients. And in fact, mortality in this large cohort reduced year on year quite significantly. What we're not seeing is a corresponding benefit for patients who are older, where obviously the incidence and prevalence is rising most rapidly. And whether that's because we're better at detecting AF, whether that's because people with heart failure and coronary syndromes in particular are living much longer now due to much better treatment, and so later on are getting AF, still we seem to be missing a group of people in our management of AF. And again, I don't need to tell this group that we generally focus our research or have done on patients with who have rhythm control, basically those are paroxysmal AF. But the majority of patients out there in the community have AF that we don't intend to use rhythm control on. And of these patients, around half will have heart failure. We used to think it's 30 to 40%. The long-term Framingham data suggests it's over 60%. Whatever the number is, it's incredibly common. And we don't really have very good trials to look at that. So that's why we set up RATE-AF. There are two usual options for rate control in these sorts of patients, particularly where you don't know whether they have heart failure. I think if you definitely know they don't have heart failure, then calcium channel blockers are useful. But for the most part, that may be not something that we know up front. So if we look at the data of beta blockers, again, I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but there's been a question from our group as well as many others about the efficacy of beta blockers when both AF and heart failure combine. These are the big randomized trials, and we looked at the patients who had an ECG at baseline, which showed AF. And unlike sinus rhythm, we don't see that mortality benefit. And in fact, we've recently republished this with using an AI tool, and you can see that in the Lancet. The other side, digoxin, is difficult because, of course, we're reliant on biased observational data. There are actually have been no randomized trials that directly compared drugs in either AF or AF and heart failure. If you look in sinus rhythm, it looks like digoxin kills you, but of course that's not the case. When you adjust and eventually get to the randomized trials, you find that there's no difference in mortality. But we didn't have really much information on patients who have AF. So we want to look and put those questions together. So RATE-AF was designed to see if long-term heart rate control, and that's important, in patients with permanent AF and symptoms of heart failure would be better treated with either digoxin or current standard of care, which is beta blocker therapy. So we looked at 60-year-old patients or over who had MHA class 2 breathlessness, any ejection fraction, but we didn't want obviously patients who'd had a recent decompensation or had IV furosemide recently. The trial was developed by a public engagement team, and I'll go into that at the end. And so the outcomes were focused on the patient care. So we reached our target of 160 patients. Most of these were, as you might expect, in routine clinical practice. The average age was 76, about a half were women. Patients generally had moderate or severe symptoms as per the EHRA class. Half of the patients, remember all of them had MHA class 2 or above, but half actually had signs of heart failure at baseline. And you can see, I think Winnie's talked about BNP being elevated in these patients. It's well over 1,000 on average. 20% or 1 in 5, just under that, had an actual ejection fraction less than 50%. This was a robust measurement, and I'll show you some information on how we did that later on. So remember, this is a long-term study, so actually we wanted to look at over 6 and 12 months, and at the primary endpoint of 6 months, 96% of those who were randomized to digoxin were still taking it, and you can see we're using low dose here. So the mean was 161 micrograms. A bit smaller numbers than that were still taking their beta blockers by 6 months. Some of those are transferred over to calcium channel blockers, but we did try to avoid any crossover between the two arms directly. All of them were followed up. An interesting point that we didn't need additional rate control, and this is just a plea for patience with these patients, that actually if you wait and see how these drugs work, you often don't need to use multiple agents for these outpatient rate control patients. So in terms of heart rate, what did we see? Well, interestingly, there were no differences in heart rate. So low dose digoxin versus beta blockers, contrary to, I think, popular belief, but bearing in mind that most of the trial data that you will have seen is basically over a few days or a few weeks. We know that digoxin takes a lot longer to have its activity than beta blockers. So when you look over the long term, actually, there were no differences. And in fact, no differences in heart rate as well when you look at the post-exertion heart rate. So after they've done a 6-minute walk test, sorry. None of the patients who had the digoxin, who randomized to digoxin, needed pacemakers. 2 in the beta blocker arm did. Pauses, as we know, are very common in these patients, but there were no differences really between the arms. So the primary outcome, which was at 6 months, was the physical related quality of life, and reassuringly there was no difference here with our standard of care, which is beta blockers. You'll see that in all of these graphs, the orange is the digoxin, that as time goes by, there seems to be a benefit compared to beta blockers, and you see that in all of the secondary outcomes here as well. I've grayed out the mental health type ones and the body pain ones, but you can see for nearly all of the others, the digoxin, the longer patients are on it, they seem to be doing better. And in fact, a few of the secondary outcomes become significant by 12 months. The other thing to note is how dramatically reduced quality of life is in these patients compared to age-related norms. So that's something to bear in mind for our clinical practice. This, I think, just explains that a little bit easier. So this is the modified EHRA class at baseline, and then as the patients go through, and you can see this sort of rather dramatic improvement in the first 6 months in most of the patients in digoxin, who eventually, quite a few of them become asymptomatic from their AF, whereas in beta blocker therapy, those randomized here actually had a very mixed picture, including some who deteriorated both early and later on in the trial. We did pre-specify a 2-class improvement from baseline in our analysis, and you can see the difference here is quite dramatic. And it particularly all happens up front. So within the first few months, as we saw in the graph, these patients are benefiting, but it does continue over 12 months. Consistent with that, we saw differences in MYJ class, which is significant. BNP actually reduced at each time point in the digoxin arm, but increased in the beta blocker arm, and so that was significant at 12 months. And reassuringly, even though 1 in 5 patients had poor EF at the beginning, there was no difference in the overall ejection fraction. We've got to be careful with clinical events because obviously this is a small trial. The only p-value I will show you is the pre-specified for total adverse events. You can see we didn't really need a high threshold for that. There was a dramatic difference in these 2 arms. I think it's worth noting that the difference was also seen, again, I'm not going to show you a p-value for that, but for serious adverse events, but also for things like unplanned hospital admissions and primary care visits for AF or cardiovascular disease. Now, RATE-AF was always planned as a pilot to see if this would work as a large outcomes trial. Hopefully this will happen at some point. Obviously, there are some other digoxin and digitoxin trials out there at the moment in Netherlands and in Germany and Austria. So hopefully we will get some more data on the fact that potentially these drugs might be valuable, not just for patient-reported outcomes, but also long-term clinical outcomes. I just wanted to sort of end with a few bits of new information. I'd like to just introduce Karina here. She's a cardiac technician, an echocardiographer, who helped to run the RATEF trial. She's done some amazing work on the echo findings, laboriously going through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of loops for each of these patients for each variable. And I just wanted to point out something that's really interesting, that we use cardiac imaging all the time in patients who are in AF. We don't really think about what the results mean. We generally are asked by guidelines to take 10 or 5 beats and average them. Whether you do that in clinical practice is a different matter, and we usually do 1 or 3. But you can see actually that the rates of coefficient of variation here, which is how much the individual beats are varying, is massive. And that sort of 60% that we see here is something that would mean that we should think about whether that should be used in clinical practice. Interestingly, if you take a more physiological approach, which is these red bars here, you can actually halve that variability, but also save you time. So do take a look at Karina's paper, and she's just been awarded a prestigious fellowship. So hopefully this will be work that you can use in your practice later on. The other area is that this was a patient and public-led trial, and they've done a lot of work, including doing their own research on what is important to patients with AF and how we as clinicians should help to manage them. You can see the dramatic difference in AF patients, even compared to other long-standing conditions. And so really that bringing in that patient voice is important. One thing I learned is that we improved our patients' breathing and their palpitations, but then because of that, they felt more able to exercise, and then they got limited by things like arthritis and COPD. So the holistic management of these patients isn't just important for the patient, it's important for us to see the overall improvement in quality of life for our patients. So with that, I'll just thank the entire team. They've put together some amazing stuff, including how to engage public, and that you can see in the European Heart Journal recently. But just to thank everyone, including lots of people in the audience, including Greg and Paulus and John, obviously, who've contributed to this trial and the patient care that we've hopefully improved because of it. Thank you very much.